Jelaine from TSC Tuition, and today I'll be talking about how to make sure your writing is formal. If you're a high school student, at some point you're probably going to have to write an essay. An essay is essentially a long, formal written response to a question. The difference between a formal and an informal register is the assumption of a relationship. If you're speaking informally to someone, you're foregoing certain levels of politeness because you assume they're not going to be offended when you speak informally. You assume that they're going to be okay with what you're saying, even if it's not the most polite. In formal writing, we don't assume this relationship. We don't assume that you know your audience or your reader at all, and so we don't assume that they're going to be okay if you forego certain levels of politeness. Formality also gives you a tone of authority, even if you are a Year 10 student writing about Macbeth. So if that's the aim of writing in a formal register, here are 3 things to take note of when you're trying to write formally. The first is the use of contractions, or rather, avoiding the use of contractions. A contraction is where we mush 2 words into 1 word, usually by dropping a vowel or more than 1 vowel. Classic examples of this are I'm instead of I am, you're instead of you are, it's instead of it is. In spoken communication, we shorten these words because it's easier to say. Instead of saying, I am going to the shops, do you want to come with me? It's easier and quicker to say, I'm going to the shops, do you want to come with me? While this is perfectly okay in spoken communication, when we're trying to write formally, we don't want to use those contractions at all. Because again, we don't assume that you have that relationship with your reader. So when you're writing and when you're proofreading, just stay away from contractions. The second thing to look out for to make your writing more formal is avoiding the use of personal pronouns. Personal pronouns refer specifically to these words: I, my, me, mine, you, your, we, us, our. We try not to use these words because these words imply that there's a relationship between you, the writer, and the reader. It suggests that you are talking to them directly or that you are referring to yourself in relation to them. And remember, when we're trying to write formally, we try not to assume that relationship at all. The third thing to look out for when we're trying to write formally is trying to avoid the use of slang. When we use slang, we assume that they understand what our slang means. And again, in formal writing, we don't want to assume that relationship. Now, this one's a little bit harder to spot and to be aware of if you're not sure what formal language looks like. The easiest way I've found to help my students identify their use of slang is to ask them to imagine their grandparents reading it out loud. If it sounds like something that their grandparent might say, then chances are it's probably going to be pretty formal. If it's not something that they can imagine their grandparents saying, it's probably not formal enough. Now, of course, this is not a perfect way to demonstrate the use of slang to students. You might have a grandparent who's very on top of 2019 slang, or you might have a grandparent who doesn't speak English. If that's the case, try and imagine an older English speaker reading your essay out loud. The reason why I try and get my students to imagine this is because slang is usually quite modern, and slang has a tendency to become more accepted in wider communication, including formal communication over time. Shakespeare used a lot of slang in his writing, but over time we no longer consider them to be slang. So chances are, if you can imagine your grandparent or an older English speaker saying your words out loud and it sounds quite natural for them to do so, it probably will read fairly formally. So I hope that was helpful. As always, like and subscribe to all our social media so you can get all our tips and tricks for all the VCE English subjects. On our social medias, we do post things other than videos, so go and check them out. And if you'd like to get some one-to-one tutoring in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, please contact us and we can send someone out to you. Thanks for watching.